So we're going to talk this morning for a bit about legacy. Legacy. The word legacy is defined in the dictionary as a gift of property, anything handed down from the past as from an ancestor or predecessor. Legacy is something I think about more these days than I used to. I think the older that we get, the more we tend to focus on legacy. Our younger years are actually legacy building years, but I suppose we don't think too much about it at that time because we're pretty busy. We're raising our families, we're pursuing careers, making our mark, so to speak. We're busy doing those things that become our legacy. When I turned 60, which has now been, I guess, 2 years ago, when I turned 60, I began to think of the decade of my 60s as legacy decade. And that's just kind of how it's been impressed upon me. And I started a blog when I turned 60. I haven't really publicized it much, but I felt it would be perhaps a tool for those of us of a similar age, a forum for sharing some thoughts. If by chance you want to visit that blog, there's the address for it. But here's something I wrote on it the day that I started it, because I think this sums up thoughts that I have in terms of legacy. We're the generation that came of age during the tumultuous 60s. Now we're in our 60s. 6 decades of life experience, careers, marriage, children, grandchildren, hopes, dreams, disappointments, failures, successes. We've been around the block and we know a thing or two about life. We're trying to put things in perspective as we view mortality a little more clearly now. We're more comfortable in our own skin. Wisdom has taught us what matters most in life. We see that relationships matter more than we thought before. We're becoming more focused on legacy, what will be remembered for when we're gone, and what has lasting value. So, sounds like somebody with a little too much time on their hands, perhaps, thinking about things. But those were thoughts that I had as I turned 60. Along with that, I guess, having been your pastor for over 10 years, I think a lot about legacy at this stage of the game, too. What impact will my life, my work, and my ministry have had upon you individually and upon the life and the work of this congregation? 3 things about legacy that I want to bring before you this morning. Legacy, number 1, frames the past. Secondly, legacy promotes important priorities. Thirdly, legacy appeals to the next generation. Those thoughts are founded in Joshua 24. If you're not turned there, I encourage you to turn to Joshua chapter 24. I believe a great legacy chapter. Very first verse tells us that Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before the Lord. A 110-year-old man by the name of Joshua gathered the people of God in a particular place that we're told is called Shechem. And it's good to pause for a few moments to talk about that location where they gathered, because it in itself was an important legacy location. Someone has summed it up this way. If you were to put Plymouth Rock and Yorktown and Lexington and Independence Hall together, you would have what Shechem is to Israel. So that might help as you think about American history. It was a very significant place where Joshua gathered the people of God for what we will notice is a legacy building event. Genesis chapter 12 verses 6 and 7 tell us that this place called Shechem is where Abraham built an altar to God after God had appeared to him and after God had confirmed his covenant to Abraham. So that's the beginning of the significance of this place where the people of Israel had gathered together. Later on, Abraham's grandson Jacob buried his foreign idols, and that in itself is a little hard for me to wrap my mind around, but he buried his foreign idols in that place called Shechem as he had come back from the promised land, and he built his home there, and he also built an altar there as his grandfather had to Yahweh God, and that's recorded in Genesis chapter 33. So we begin to get the idea this place is very significant to Israel, the people of God. It is a legacy location. And so in that legacy location, there's a very important legacy building event that takes place. Looking in verses 2 to 13, I'm not going to read those verses, but I want you to skim down through the things that are being said here, verses 2 to 13. It is a record of where Joshua frames the things that have been done in the past for the people of God. And I really ought to correct and say it wasn't really Joshua that said these things. It was God speaking through Joshua, because right away here it says, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." So Joshua is the mouthpiece of God. So this is really what God had to say in framing the past. This important legacy thing here. He's framing the past. He's recounting their history. And I want you to notice the things as you skim down through these verses. First of all, not surprisingly, it begins with Abraham. Abraham figures very prominently in this. Verses 2 to 4. How God had called Abraham's father, how God had called Abraham and also Abraham's brother. It says, who had served other gods. That is interesting. We revere Abraham, the father of the faith. We think about him as a man of impeccable character. But it's interesting that at least his father and his brother, and very likely Abraham himself, had served other gods. Idol worshipers in the land of Mesopotamia. And it is interesting that God would work through Abraham. God called him. It was truly an act of grace that God would choose him, because he's really not qualified. God qualifies him. God chooses him because that's how God does things. God takes those that he wants to call, and he works his amazing grace through them. That's what he did through Abraham. And in fact, as you look through these verses, that is the summary of Israel's history. Really, grace is being stressed. I know Brother Joe talked about grace last week. This fits pretty well. Grace is to be found throughout Israel's history. Again, Abraham did not deserve the call. He worshiped other gods. But God in His grace called Abraham out. I want to use this man. God called him. The Israelites, in captivity in Egypt, they did not deserve to be called out of captivity, but God brought them out as He recounts their history. God took a curse and turned it into a blessing, because in these verses there's a man by the name of Balaam that is mentioned, a prophet for hire, so to speak. If you've ever read the story, the thing that stands out is this talking donkey that got him straight where he needed to go and what he needed to do. But anyway, God, according to His grace, took a curse from this man and turned it into a blessing for the people of Israel. And then as God continues to recount their history here, God speaks about the fact that He defeated Jericho for them. We looked at that story a few weeks ago. It wasn't the people of God that won the victory. It was God who did it on behalf of the Israelites. As the story goes on, God drove out 2 kings before the Israelites. And God gave them the land that they had really freshly stepped foot in. The promised land. And verse 13 summarizes it, I think, very, very well. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities which you had not built, and you've lived in them, and you are eating of the vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. God recounts His legacy of grace to the people of Israel. That's how it's framed. It's framed according to God's grace shown to the people of God. And guess what? That's exactly what our legacy is as well. It is a legacy of grace. How God has worked in our lives. How God has done things that we have not deserved. God has chosen to do those things for us. Every one of us have a legacy of grace. You could tell your story of your legacy of grace. I know that I did not deserve to be raised in a home where I had a faithful Christian mother who took myself and my sister to Sunday school and church. I didn't deserve that kind of environment, but by God's grace, That's the environment I was raised in. I did not deserve to come to saving faith in Jesus Christ at the age of 17. But in God's grace, I did. I do not deserve to be called to a life of service and ministry, but unmistakably as a teenager, God issued a call to me. And I know it was because, not that I deserved it, but because of His favor. And I know that there was a time I was spared from a car accident. To this day, I do not know how it was avoided, but God's hand and God's grace was upon me to protect me. And I know that I've had some very specific spirit experiences that I did not deserve, but God allowed those things to happen to me. I'm forever grateful, but it was His grace that did that, and on. My story could go, and I know yours as well. We have a legacy of grace. Legacy promotes some very important priorities. Perhaps best known in this chapter are verses 14 and 15. Joshua says, really God speaking through Joshua, "Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve Him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The past is prologue. Why did God recount the history of His dealings with the people of Israel? It was to lead them up to that point of being able to prioritize the important things that needed to take place in light of that rather amazing history. So if a legacy of grace would mean anything at all, it means this, out of the New Jerusalem translation: "Now fear Yahweh and serve Him truly and sincerely. Banish the gods whom your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh." The legacy of grace was designed to lead them to that point where they realized this is the step to be taken today. This is the thing that makes sense. This is the thing, if our hearts are touched by what God has done, then this is the thing. We stand in awe of a God who would do these kind of things. We stand in awe of Him, and to serve Him truthfully, sincerely, with all of our heart, to serve Him in that way, to put away anything else abhorrent to Him, to put away any other kind of gods in our lives, to put them behind us, and to serve Him and to serve Him alone. Now in verse 15, looking back at that again, Joshua said, "If it doesn't please you to worship Yahweh, then choose for yourselves today the one whom you will worship." As I read those words, I don't think Joshua was really offering them an option. I don't think Joshua was saying this is a multiple choice kind of thing. You can serve Yahweh God, or you can serve these other gods. Kind of a rhetorical type of thing. When you look at the legacy of grace, of what God has done, the choice ought to be very, very obvious to you. Why in the world would you serve gods who haven't done a thing for you? Instead, you want to serve this God who has done all of these incredible things. "But as for me and my house," Joshua says, "we will serve the Lord." What stands out to me is that Joshua didn't just say, "I will serve the Lord." He says, "I and my household will serve the Lord." What's interesting is Joshua at this point in his life does not have an abundance of time to mentor his family and his household as if maybe they're not in line with this. This is the last act of a great man of God. He's 110 years old. The next thing we're going to read is that he dies. But he could stand confidently at that point and to say, you all need to make a choice, but make certain you understand what I'm saying. The choice is clear. Concerning me and my whole household, we will serve the Lord. The choice is made. And so he's confident concerning the impact that he has had upon his household and upon his family. Verses 16 to 18, the people answered and said, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God is He who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and who did these great signs in our sight, and preserved us through all the way in which we went, and among all the peoples through whose midst we passed. The Lord drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites who lived in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for He is our God." And so that's their pledge that day. We understand our history. We recount the history that God just gave us and talked about. We understand that. And so we also, Joshua, make this pledge that we will serve Him, because the choice is obvious. But verse 19, Joshua said to the people, "You will not be able to serve the Lord, for He is a holy God, He is a jealous God, and He will not forgive your transgression or your sins." I think what Joshua is saying is, if you are just speaking about serving Him by your own determination, it won't work. It's going to require something more. It's going to require His help to do it. I think it's a little bit like Peter on the night when Jesus was arrested. "Oh, I'm with you. I'll stand by you no matter what. Hey, you're going to deny me 3 times tonight." His determination was by his own strength, and I think that's the point that Joshua makes to these people. You better lean on this God that you're willing to serve, because your own determination will not be good enough. So, verses 21 on down here, the people said to Joshua, "No, but we will serve the Lord." And Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves, that you have chosen for yourselves the Lord to serve Him." And they said, "We are witnesses. Now therefore put away the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God, and we will obey His voice." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made for them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, "Behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which He spoke to us. Thus it shall be for a witness against you, so that you do not deny your God." And then Joshua dismissed the people, each to his own inheritance. So again, a rather legacy-building event takes place. And he even refers to this stone in a figurative sense. The stone's heard the words. Every time you see the stone, remember the pledge that you made. Remember the covenant that you've entered into the God who's given you a legacy of grace. And the things that follow after those verses, there's 3 funerals. First of all, in verse 29, it talks about, after these things, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And then if you jump down to verse 32, an interesting thing, it says, "They buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt at Shechem, in the piece of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and they became an inheritance of Joseph's sons." A little backstory helps here, and this also brings out the legacy of grace of what God had shown to His people. Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 to 26, the very last words of Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid." I like that. He will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land that He promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. "When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here." Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. Hundreds of years they carried the bones of Joseph around. Joseph died with full confidence of what God would do in His faithfulness to His people. He said, "When God comes to your aid," not if God comes to your aid, when God comes to your aid, then you're to bring my bones and bury them in that special place called Shechem, according to the promises that God has made to us, His people. It is a legacy of grace. All those many years, the bones of Joseph were brought and buried in that very place where these events took place. There's a third funeral. Mentions a man by the name of Eleazar, who was a faithful priest and a man of God. And then I want to back up to verse 31. This is a great place to leave the story because it says, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known all the deeds of the Lord which He had done for Israel. It's a great story. We know later on things don't work out so well. But what a bright spot as the people of God thought about what God had done for them. They remained faithful to Him. Great, powerful story about legacy. Again, legacy frames the past. Legacy promotes important priorities. Legacy appeals to the next generation. God has faithfully led every one of us up to this day. God has been faithful to us as He has been the people of Israel throughout their existence. Our very life, our very existence is a tribute to the faithfulness of God and the grace of God. And so that legacy of faithfulness calls for us to choose. Choose today. Choose today. Yesterday's choice is not necessarily today's decision. So as we think about Joshua's words, there is a decision to be made today, right now. In this very moment, this is kind of our Shechem, where we choose right here and right now and say, I choose God. I choose Yahweh God. I choose to serve Him now. I may have chosen yesterday, but I choose right now. And it's very appropriate as we're gathered as the people of God to say, I choose. I choose right now. I choose to serve God, to fear Him, to revere Him. I choose to serve Him sincerely and truthfully. I choose to turn away from anything that is abhorrent to Him. I choose Him again today in this moment. I choose right now to serve. I choose to worship Him right now. I will not presume upon my choice made in the past. And I will not presume on a choice made in the future. I know personally I choose right now, this moment. These words found in verse 15 are very near and dear to me, as I'm sure they are to many of you. And I think about ways that we are reminded of them personally. There is a wall in our house, which I'd like to show at this point, if we can. There's a wall in our house. I think the next slide, please. Please, there we go. That's a wall in our house. Jill thought it important enough to put that verse on our wall. It is an ongoing reminder. There's another reminder that means a lot to me, and we've had it for several years. Several years ago, my brother-in-law, and I think he put a lot of effort in it to be able to put something like that together. My brother-in-law engraved this for our household. It is something that means a great deal because it is that reminder. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Whatever you need for a reminder, I think it's important to have that, to be reminded of this important priority. And I pray that each one of us can say, as Joshua said, as for me and my house, indeed we will serve the Lord.